Have you ever felt like you're on a slightly different frequency than everyone around you? Not better, not worse, just different. You sit through a conversation that should feel easy, and somehow it leaves you drained. You get through a party or a family dinner and come home needing an hour of silence, just to feel like yourself again. Meanwhile, the people around you seem to walk out of the same room energized. If that sounds familiar, here's what I want you to know before we go any further. It's not loneliness, and it's not a flaw you need to fix. It may simply be that your mind processes the world in a specific, recognizable way, one that psychologists have studied closely. There are several psychological traits and patterns that can show up in people who experience the world a little differently, and most of them spend years quietly misunderstanding themselves, apologizing for themselves, shrinking themselves to fit rooms that were never built for them. This video is for the ones who are done shrinking. Let's go through 10 of those traits, one at a time. The first trait is this: you recharge alone. Not because you dislike people, some of the people you love most genuinely light you up, but extended social time, long evenings of being on, a full weekend of plans back to back, doesn't just tire you the way a long day tires most people, it empties you. There's a real difference between being tired and feeling erased. Think about the last big gathering you were at. You were probably tracking more than the conversation itself who seemed off, who was performing confidence they didn't feel, how the tone in the room shifted when a certain topic came up. That's not idle observation. For some people, it's close to constant background processing. In a conversation, you may find yourself noticing expressions, shifts in tone, body language, and the emotional atmosphere around you almost automatically. For some people, that takes real effort even when they're enjoying themselves. So if solitude is where you go afterward to feel like yourself again, that's not you withdrawing from the world. It's recovery. A world built around extroverted norms often mislabels this need as antisocial or aloof. It usually isn't either of those things, it's just a different energy budget. This is also why the recovery itself doesn't have to look like much from the outside. It might just be sitting in your car for 10 minutes before walking into the house. It might be turning your phone face down for an hour after a long call. None of that needs an explanation or an apology attached to it. The goal isn't to need less recovery time, it's to stop treating the recovery time itself as something to justify. The second trait: you can't stay on the surface of a topic. Someone gives you an answer, and your mind immediately asks why. You get that answer, and you find yourself asking again. Not to be difficult, and not out of anxiety incomplete information genuinely bothers you, the way an unfinished sentence bothers other people. Maybe you've noticed this at work, in a meeting where everyone else nods along at a decision, and you're the one asking what happens if the assumption underneath it turns out to be wrong. You may have been told you overthink, that you need to just let things go. What's actually happening has a name in psychology: a high need for cognition and enjoyment of effortful thinking for its own sake rather than thinking as a means to an end. Research on need for cognition has linked it with more effortful and careful thinking, not necessarily higher intelligence, but a habit of not stopping at the first plausible answer. If this sounds like you, it doesn't prove anything grand about your mind on its own. It may simply mean you have a stronger tendency to keep exploring a question after others are ready to move on. The third trait shows up as something else entirely: you seem unmotivated by things that don't matter to you. At some point, someone may have called you passive, or said you have so much potential but won't apply yourself. Maybe it was a teacher, a manager, a parent. If that stung, here's another way to look at it. You've probably noticed you can throw yourself completely into a project you care about, losing track of time, skipping meals, forgetting to check your phone while a task that should take 20 minutes but doesn't interest you can take you all day to start. Motivation research shows people vary a lot in how much external pressure moves them versus how much a task needs to align with something they personally value before they'll engage with it. This isn't automatic proof of a superior mind. Plenty of things affect follow-through, including stress, environment, and ordinary executive functioning. But for some people, a low response to outside pressure specifically reflects strong internal standards. If something doesn't genuinely matter to them, they can't convincingly fake caring about it, no matter the incentive. That's worth separating from laziness, even when it's inconvenient for the people around you. It's worth adding that this can create real friction, not just misunderstanding. A manager who needs a team to move quickly on a low-stakes task doesn't always have room to ask why it matters first. That doesn't mean the trait is wrong, it means it sometimes needs translating. Finding a version of a task's purpose that you can genuinely connect with, even a small one, tends to work better than trying to force motivation you don't feel. The fourth trait, you pick up on things people don't say out loud. You walk into a room and within moments, you sense who's uncomfortable, who's performing confidence, whose words don't match their energy. You've probably had the experience of a friend saying "I'm fine" and knowing immediately, without being able to fully explain how, that they weren't. This tracks with what psychologists call empathic accuracy. Combined with a heightened sensitivity to nonverbal cues, subtle facial expressions, shifts in tone, posture, and other small signals that most people register only faintly, if at all. It doesn't mean you understand people better than they understand themselves. That's overstating a real thing into something mystical. It means you may sometimes catch emotional signals that others miss entirely, or miss until much later. That can be a genuine strength in close relationships and difficult conversations. It can also be exhausting, because it isn't something you can switch off just because you'd like a break from other people's inner weather. The fifth trait, you go quiet when things fall apart. Not because you don't feel it, you may feel it more intensely than the people visibly panicking around you, but something in you steps back before reacting. Almost like a built-in pause button between the event and your response to it. People have probably called this cold, or wondered aloud why you're not more emotional in a crisis. What they're usually watching is distress tolerance, the capacity to sit with a strong emotion without being run by it in the moment. Some people build this deliberately, through therapy, breathwork, or years of practice. For others, it seems to come more naturally, showing up as far back as they can remember. Either way, it isn't coldness, and it doesn't require a difficult backstory to explain it. For some people, this steadiness grows out of hard experience. For others, it may simply reflect a naturally steadier nervous system. Both are legitimate, and neither one needs a dramatic origin story to be real. In practice, this often looks less dramatic than it sounds. It's the friend who doesn't cry at the funeral, but quietly handles the logistics everyone else is too overwhelmed to think about. It's the coworker who stays level during a deadline crunch, not because the stakes don't register, but because panicking has never actually helped them solve anything. The feeling is still there. It's just not steering. The sixth trait, you've felt older than your age for a long time. Not arrogantly, and not with any contempt for your peers, just a quiet sense that the things urgently occupying the people around you don't land the same way for you. Maybe as a kid, you gravitated toward adults' conversations at family gatherings instead of the other children. Maybe in your 20s, while friends were focused on the next weekend, you were already thinking about what you wanted the next decade to look like. Some psychologists describe this as an earlier than usual interest in questions of meaning, identity, mortality, and purpose, the kind of questions most people start sitting with later in life, if they sit with them at all. It can create a specific, quiet kind of isolation. You're not ahead of anyone in a competitive sense. You may simply have become interested in certain questions earlier than the people around you, and sometimes found yourself waiting for the people around you to become interested in the same questions. The seventh trait, you feel the gap between who you are and who you could be. There's a version of yourself you carry around in the back of your mind, not a fantasy, just a steady sense of what you believe you're capable of, and alongside it, a quiet, low-grade awareness of the distance between that version and where you currently stand. This might show up as a nagging feeling on a Sunday night, a sense that the week ahead won't quite use what you're actually capable of. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a gap between perceived potential and actual achievement, and note it as a genuine, ongoing source of quiet frustration for people who hold high standards for themselves. It isn't automatically self-punishment. It can simply mean you haven't lowered your own bar to match your current circumstances, which is its own kind of discomfort. Worth naming honestly instead of either dismissing it or turning it into a source of shame. It also helps to notice when this gap is actually useful and when it's just weighing you down. A little distance between where you are and where you could be tends to keep people moving, learning, adjusting, but left unexamined, the same gap can quietly turn into a standard nothing you do will ever meet. The difference usually comes down to whether you're using it to decide what to try next, or just using it to feel bad about what you haven't done yet. The 8th trait, small talk, feels like a missed opportunity. Not boring exactly, more like being handed a script in a language that has no words for what you actually want to say. Weather, weekend plans, the usual pleasantries at the start of a meeting or a party, it can feel like standing right next to something real and choosing to discuss nothing instead. You've probably noticed how a 2-hour dinner with acquaintances can feel more tiring than a 20-minute phone call with the one friend you can actually talk to about anything. That's consistent with what some researchers describe as a need for depth in conversation. For a meaningful share of people, shallow exchanges don't just fail to satisfy, they're genuinely draining in a way that has nothing to do with introversion or extroversion. If this is you, the fix usually isn't more people in your life. It's fewer conversations that go nowhere, and more that actually do. The 9th trait is closely related, but distinct. You're at ease with silence, even when it unsettles the people around you. That's a different thing from the trait before it, which was about wanting deeper conversation when you do talk. This one is about your relationship with your own internal world when nobody's talking at all. You can sit with someone for 20 minutes in a car or on a porch without speaking and feel completely connected to them. You can spend an entire evening alone with no television on, no music, no background noise, and feel genuinely at peace rather than restless or bored. That tends to unnerve people who are simply more accustomed to constant stimulation and conversation for them. Quiet can feel unfamiliar rather than restful. Being comfortable there isn't nothing. It usually means you've already spent real time with yourself, including the parts of your own mind that aren't easy to sit with. That comfort tends to build over time rather than arrive all at once. Most people's first experience of real. Unfilled silence is uncomfortable. The mind reaches for something to do because it isn't used to being left alone with itself. What changes for some people is that they stay in it long enough for the discomfort to pass, and on the other side of it is something closer to quiet than to boredom. The 10th and final trait, you feel slightly outside every room, even the ones you belong to. Not loneliness exactly. Loneliness is a reaching toward something that's absent. This is different, standing just outside of every group you're part of, fully present and participating, but with one part of you always quietly watching from a slight distance. You found people you like, groups that check most of the boxes on paper. And there's still a quiet awareness underneath it that you're here, but not entirely here. Research on existential isolation suggests that this feeling can arise even when a person has a strong and clearly defined inner world. It isn't a disorder to be treated. The more specific and worked out your sense of who you are, the harder it can be to find a perfect match for it in another person. Not fitting everywhere doesn't mean something is wrong with you. Sometimes it simply means you've become clear about who you are, and clarity, by its nature, doesn't fit into every room it walks into. Every one of these 10 traits has probably been used against you at some point. Your solitude, called antisocial. Your depth, called overthinking. Your selectivity, called laziness. Your steadiness, called coldness. Your quiet, called strange. The people who said those things weren't always wrong about what they were seeing. They were often wrong about what it meant. One more pattern worth naming before we close. There's a habit that tends to travel alongside these 10 traits, an unusual comfort with changing your mind. Most people unconsciously defend their existing beliefs, because changing them can feel like admitting fault. That's the basis of what's called confirmation bias, our tendency to favor evidence that confirms what we already think and to overlook what doesn't. People who recognize themselves in the traits above often experience new, better evidence differently, not as a threat to defend against, but as progress. That takes a specific kind of security, separating your identity from your opinions, so that being wrong about something becomes information instead of a personal loss. It also tends to make disagreement feel different. Someone challenges an idea you hold, and instead of hearing it as "you're wrong about this," it registers more like, "here's something I hadn't considered yet." That's not the same as having no convictions. It's holding your convictions a little more loosely than your identity, so a good argument can move one without threatening the other. The same underlying pattern tends to show up in smaller ways too, in protecting your attention rather than letting every notification and argument pull at it. In sorting criticism into someone's opinion versus something I can actually use instead of rejecting or absorbing it wholesale, and in treating failure as information about what happened rather than a verdict on who you are. None of these are really separate traits. They're the same mind showing the same pattern in a few more places. So where does that leave you? None of this means you're better than the people around you, and it isn't a diagnosis or a personality type to wear like a badge. What it offers is something more useful than either of those: awareness. And awareness gives you a choice. You can stop fighting the way your mind works and start using it more intentionally. Once you understand why you experience the world this way, you can start building a life that actually fits it, relationships that value honesty over performance, work that holds your curiosity instead of just paying the bills, and fewer apologies for needing solitude, depth, or time to think something through before you commit to it. Which trait felt the most uncomfortably familiar? Drop the number in the comments. Sometimes that's all it takes to remind someone else that they aren't the only one who has felt this way. And if psychology, personality, and the patterns behind human behavior interest you, subscribe for the next one. Understanding your own mind is quiet work, without much applause along the way, but it's some of the most useful work you'll ever do. You don't need to become less different. You just need to understand what your difference is asking you to become.